Good morning. Welcome to the Lifeway Social Insider email. I'm going to film this video really quick and add it to the email so that I can get this email out to you. I apologize for this week's email being so late. It's going to be a couple hours later than normal because I've just had a lot going on in my life in the last 24 hours. So I apologize that this is later than normal. And this video will probably be shorter than normal, but it's timely and I want to try to help you however I can. So here are 3 ways not to respond to tragedy on social media. This week, a tragic school shooting, deadlier than Columbine, happened in Parkland, Florida, just outside of Miami, Florida. And a lot of times, some of the questions I'm most commonly asked when it comes to these things is how do we respond, and perhaps just as importantly, if not more importantly, how do we not respond? Social media following tragedies, whether it be school shooting, bombings, or whether it be in your community or around the world, it can be really dangerous. It can be kind of a tightrope act. It can be dicey. I'm always nervous to say anything on social media following a tragedy because I know a lot of times people can intend to say something that's helpful and it ends up being not helpful. Sometimes people can try to be, can be trying to be helpful and can be really hurting others in the process. And I never want to be that. And so sometimes I just kind of keep my mouth shut and say my own personal prayers and help others however I can privately. I tend to kind of go quiet after these things. But if you feel like God's given you a place and a voice and the gifts to help and serve people online, here are 3 mistakes I would try to avoid if I were you. Okay. So number 1, focusing on the criminal. I always think it's unhelpful, and a lot of these 3 things tend to be more my opinion and my stance. It's not hard and fast. This is not law. I'm not saying you're a terrible person if you do these things, but this is just my experience on social media. Okay, so number 1, I think you should not focus on the criminal. I don't think it's helpful to flash the face and name up. Some news organizations have to do their job, but you as a private individual, focusing on the criminal, even if you're talking about how terrible of a person he or she is, focusing on the criminal usually does more harm than good. It can glorify the person. It can make them seem like, hey, you can get attention if you do this kind of a thing. And a lot of these people who do these terrible things are just trying to get attention. And so I think focusing on the criminal following a tragic event tends to be problematic. So I would avoid that if I were you. 2, using the tragedy to forward your own agenda. This can mean a broad scope of things, and I wrote it that way, meaning that using a tragedy to forward your own agenda is unhelpful in the days following a tragedy, a school shooting or otherwise. Now, some of you might be upset, like, well, it's as good a time as ever to talk about gun control, things like that. I agree. I think those conversations need to happen. I think when it happens in the context of sort of a selfish pursuit of your own agenda, it's problematic. And this is just something you have to examine in your own heart. I'm not saying you can't talk about gun control following a school shooting online. I think you can. But I think if you're doing it because you want to be seen as right or you want to be seen as a sort of virtuous person, I think that's where it can get problematic. So I think calling for Congress to do things about preventing school shootings or calling for certain things to be considered can all be valid. But I think if you look at a tragedy and say, oh, now I can push blank, whatever that is, you need to check your heart. Don't use social media following a tragedy to push some sort of personal agenda or plan, whether it be political, legislative, spiritual, whatever. Look to use social media following a tragedy to help and serve other people, not help and serve your own purposes. That's all I'm trying to say. 3rd, criticizing the people involved. So there's a temptation following a school shooting or following other tragedies to criticize the police or the school, or people aren't usually criticizing the victims, but there may be some situation in which they do that. Criticizing the FBI. I've seen a lot of people criticizing the FBI following this situation, that they could have done more, or YouTube, because the shooter left a YouTube comment a few months ago about how he wanted to shoot up a school, that YouTube should have been able to find it. There's a time to hold people to account. I think on social media, immediately following a tragedy is a lot of times not the best time to hold someone account. Everyone's emotions are raging really hot, and it's easy to kind of make accusations and go after people and be super critical that you never really follow through with any action on. So I think it's sometimes unhelpful to be super critical of a party involved in the tragedy other than the criminal following a tragic situation. So those are three mistakes that I would avoid on social media, three ways that I would not use social media following a tragedy. I hope that's timely and helpful for you. And if you would, pray for the families of the victims. It's not going to fix everything, but it can be helpful. So have a good rest of your Friday and a good weekend.